Won the night she stopped waiting. He thought she would still be there in the morning. He was wrong. There are moments in life that do not arrive with shouting. They do not slam doors. They do not break glass. They do something far more unsettling. They go quiet. That night, Ethan came home the same way he always did, late, distracted, carrying the weight of a world he believed only he could hold. The city was still awake outside. Lights flickered through the apartment window. His phone was still warm in his hand. Another meeting, another delay, another explanation he had already rehearsed before unlocking the door. He expected the familiar. Maybe the soft lamp in the corner. Maybe Claire curled up on the couch, half asleep, pretending she had not been waiting. Maybe dinner gone cold. Maybe that look in her eyes, the one that asked a question she was too tired to say out loud. Do I still matter to you when the rest of your life is louder than I am? But that night felt different the moment he stepped inside. The apartment was neat. Too neat. Not peaceful. Not warm. Just still. The kind of stillness that makes your chest tighten before your mind understands why. His keys landed on the table with a small metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have. He looked around, expecting her voice. Nothing. Then he saw it. A suitcase. Not thrown together in anger. Not dramatic. Not impulsive. Set carefully by the door like a decision that had been made long before he arrived. And suddenly, all the little things he had ignored began to press against him at once. The unanswered silence in her recent smiles. The way she had stopped asking when he would be home. The way she no longer reached for his hand when they passed each other in the kitchen. The way her sadness had become so quiet. It almost looked like peace. "Claire?" he called out, though even his voice sounded unsure. She appeared a moment later from the hallway, calm in a way that frightened him more than anger ever could. No tears. No accusation. Just tired eyes and a stillness that didn't come from rest. It came from reaching the end of something alone. For a second, Ethan almost said the thing he always said. "I can explain. Work has been crazy. You know this is temporary." But something in her face stopped him. Because for the first time, he could see it clearly. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. And that is the cruelest part about emotional distance. By the time the absent one finally feels the loss, the lonely one has already lived inside it for months. Claire looked at him the way people look at places they once called home. With tenderness. With grief. With the knowledge that love had been there once, but could not survive on memory alone. Ethan stood there, still holding his phone, still dressed for a life that suddenly felt far less important than it had an hour ago. He had spent so much time believing that love could pause. That devotion could wait. That a good woman would understand, forgive, adjust, and remain. But love does not disappear all at once. First, it waits. Then it aches. Then it goes quiet. And on some nights, when you come home too late, quiet is what's left. Before we go deeper into this story, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where the silences people live with finally find a voice. To the silence that looked like peace. At first, Ethan believed the quiet was a good sign. The arguments had stopped. The tension that once hung in the air during dinner had faded. No more late-night questions about where he had been or why his phone kept lighting up long after midnight. For a while, he even told himself something comforting. Maybe Claire had finally learned to understand him. Maybe she had accepted the rhythm of his life, the long hours. The unpredictable schedules, the endless pursuit of something just slightly out of reach. From the outside, everything looked calmer. She smiled more often. She stopped interrupting him when he was working on his laptop at the kitchen table. She didn't ask if he would be home early anymore. And strangely, Ethan felt relief. Because conflict can be exhausting. Silence, on the other hand, can look like harmony, especially to someone who has always been uncomfortable with emotions that demand attention. But silence is a strange thing. Sometimes it is peace. And sometimes it is simply what remains when someone has stopped believing their voice matters. Claire moved through the apartment gently in those weeks. Not distant. Not cold. Just careful. She still made coffee in the mornings. Still asked if he had eaten. Still kissed his cheek when she passed him in the hallway. But something subtle had shifted. She no longer lingered near him the way she once did. There were no more stories about her day waiting to be told. No more soft attempts to pull him into small conversations that had nothing to do with work. Instead, the space between them became polite. And politeness can sometimes be the quietest form of goodbye. Ethan didn't see it then. To him, things felt easier. The house was calmer. There was less emotional weight in the air. Less pressure to respond to feelings he never quite knew how to handle. He mistook her restraint for maturity. He mistook her quiet for strength. What he didn't realize was that Claire had already started a private conversation with herself, one she no longer needed him to answer. A conversation that sounded something like this. How long do you keep knocking on a door that never opens? How many times do you explain your loneliness before you begin to feel foolish for having it? And at what point does love slowly change its shape, from hope into acceptance? Claire never said these questions out loud. Not because they didn't matter, but because repeating them had begun to feel like speaking into an empty room. And so, little by little, she stopped trying to be heard. She became quieter, yes, but not weaker. Sometimes people become silent not because they have nothing left to say, but because they have finally understood that the person they love is no longer listening in the way they once hoped. The calm Ethan enjoyed during those weeks wasn't the peace he thought it was. It was the quiet before a decision. The quiet of someone learning how to let go without anger. Without blame. Just with the slow, painful clarity that love cannot survive where it is consistently unseen. And while Ethan believed things were finally getting better, Claire was quietly learning how to leave. 3. When love becomes background noise. There is a quiet transformation that happens in relationships long before anyone admits something is wrong. It doesn't arrive dramatically. It doesn't shatter the room with anger or betrayal. Instead, it fades. Like music playing in another room, still there, still technically present, but no longer something anyone is really listening to. That was what love had slowly become between Ethan and Claire. Not gone. Just unnoticed. In the beginning, Ethan used to notice everything about her. The way Claire laughed at small things that no one else found funny. The way she spoke with her hands when she was excited. The way her eyes softened when she talked about the future they imagined together. Back then, those details felt important. They made his world warmer. But over time, the rhythm of his life grew louder. Emails that needed answers. Deadlines that refused to move. Calls that came late in the evening when most people were already home. Success demanded attention. And attention, like energy, is limited. Without realizing it, Ethan began giving most of his attention to the world outside their home. The company. The clients. The next opportunity that promised to move everything forward. Meanwhile, Claire remained where she had always been. Right beside him. But love does something strange when it isn't acknowledged. It doesn't disappear overnight. It slowly becomes part of the background. Like a clock ticking in a quiet room, so constant that eventually you stop hearing it at all. Claire would speak about her day while he checked his messages. He would nod while typing. Yeah, he'd say. I'm listening. And technically, he was. But listening with half a mind is a subtle form of absence. Claire began noticing it in small moments. The way his eyes drifted toward the phone instead of her face. The way conversations ended not with curiosity, but with polite silence. The way her presence no longer interrupted his thoughts. She was there. But she was no longer the center of his attention. And attention is the oxygen of love. Without it, even the strongest connection begins to thin. Not because either person is cruel, but because life has a way of rearranging priorities without asking permission. Ethan never decided to care less. He simply assumed love could survive quietly in the background while he chased everything else in the foreground. But Claire felt the shift. At first, she tried to speak louder, not with her voice, but with her efforts. She planned dinners, suggested small weekend trips, tried to recreate the closeness they once had. Ethan agreed sometimes, but often, work found its way back in. Next week, he would say, "Things are crazy right now." And Claire would smile in that patient way people smile when they want to believe something will change. But hope has a fragile center. The more often it bends, the easier it becomes to break. Eventually, Claire stopped trying to compete with the noise of Ethan's world. Not because she stopped loving him, but because love cannot survive forever as background sound. So she grew quieter. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but from a growing understanding that when someone you love stops noticing your presence, you eventually begin learning how to live without needing it to be noticed. 4. The pattern of emotional absence. Ethan did not think of himself as a cold man. If anyone had asked, he would have said he loved deeply. He worked hard. He provided. He stayed loyal. He came home, didn't he? Wasn't that what love looked like in the real world, showing up? Paying the bills, carrying responsibility without complaint? But emotional absence rarely looks cruel from the inside. Most of the time, it looks reasonable, even noble. It looks like a man convincing himself that exhaustion is sacrifice, that silence is stability, that being physically present should count for more than emotional availability. And for years, Ethan had lived inside that pattern without ever naming it. He had learned early in life that feelings were complicated things, messy things. Things that slowed people down. Things that made them vulnerable in ways he did not trust. As a boy, he had watched love move through the house in careful, limited portions. Approval came when he performed well. Warmth came when he made life easier for everyone else. Attention came when he achieved. No one ever said it outright. No one needed to. He learned the lesson anyway. Be useful. Be composed. Do not need too much. Do not fall apart where anyone can see you. So Ethan became the kind of man who knew how to handle pressure, solve problems, and keep moving. He knew how to survive difficult days without asking for help. He knew how to carry stress in silence and wear self-control like armor. What he never learned was how to stay emotionally close when closeness required softness instead of strength. Claire would reach for conversation, and Ethan would respond with solutions. She would offer vulnerability, and he would offer reassurance without depth. She would open a door, and he would stand at the threshold, unable to step fully inside. Not because he wanted to hurt her, but because some people confuse emotional restraint with emotional maturity. They believe staying calm means staying unavailable. They believe not reacting means not damaging anyone. They believe if they avoid conflict, they are protecting the relationship. But avoidance is not peace. It is distance with better manners. And Ethan's version of love had become full of that distance. He listened, but not all the way. He cared, but at a safe distance. He stayed, but only with the parts of himself that felt controlled. Claire felt it in the pauses. In the way her deeper feelings seemed to reach a wall just before they reached him. In the way hard conversations ended too quickly. In the way he could sit beside her on the couch and still somehow feel far away. That is the thing about emotional absence. It is rarely one dramatic wound. It is repetition. A missed moment here. A deflected conversation there. A hand not held. A truth not spoken. A tenderness delayed until it no longer lands. And over time, repetition becomes pattern. Pattern becomes atmosphere. Atmosphere becomes the emotional climate of the relationship. Claire had been living in that climate for longer than Ethan realized. A place where she was not abandoned physically, but emotionally. A place where she had to keep translating her pain into smaller, softer versions so it would not overwhelm him. A place where loneliness did not come from being alone, but from being unseen beside someone who claimed to love her. Ethan never meant to build that kind of love. But unhealed people often recreate environments that feel familiar, even when those environments quietly starve the people closest to them. And what felt normal to Ethan was slowly breaking Claire's heart. 5. The quiet ways she tried to stay. Claire did not try to save the relationship in dramatic ways. She did not make ultimatums. She did not throw accusations across the room. She did not become louder, crueler, sharper just to prove that she was hurting. Instead, she loved him in the quiet ways that often go unnoticed by the person being loved. She stayed soft. And sometimes, that is the saddest kind of devotion. The kind that keeps offering warmth long after the room has gone cold. She began with small things. The kinds of things that look ordinary from the outside but carry the full weight of hope when they come from someone trying not to lose what matters. She remembered how Ethan liked his coffee when his weeks were especially hard. A little stronger. No sugar. Left on the counter just before he walked out the door. She learned to read the tension in his shoulders when he came home and chose her timing carefully. As if love itself were something that had to tiptoe. On the nights when he seemed reachable, she would ask gentle questions. How was your day, really? Not the polished version. Not the efficient version. The true one. Sometimes he answered with a sentence or two. Sometimes he gave her a tired smile and said he was fine. Claire learned not to press too hard. Not because she didn't care. But because when someone is always emotionally halfway out the door, even tenderness begins to feel risky. So she adjusted. That's what people do when they want to stay. They adjust their tone. Their needs. Their timing. Their expectations. She suggested little weekend drives, hoping a change of scenery might reopen something between them. She bookmarked restaurants he once said he wanted to try. She sent him songs that reminded her of the early version of them, the one that still laughed easily. Still reached for each other without hesitation. Sometimes Ethan responded with a heart emoji. Sometimes he said, "Let's do it next week." And next week became another week. And then another. Still, Claire kept trying. She folded her loneliness into gestures that looked almost invisible. A hand resting lightly on his back as he passed by. A dinner plate kept warm a little longer than necessary. A pause at the hallway door at night, waiting to see if he might look up and notice that she had not stopped hoping. There is something deeply human about this kind of love. It does not ask for applause. It does not announce its sacrifice. It simply keeps showing up in smaller and smaller forms, praying that one of them will finally be felt. Claire did not need perfection from Ethan. She did not need poetry. She did not need grand declarations. She needed evidence. Evidence that her presence still moved something in him. Evidence that she was not the only one carrying the emotional weight of what they had become. Evidence that she did not have to keep shrinking her heart just to fit inside his silence. But when effort is not met, it begins to change shape. At first, it feels like patience. Then it feels like sadness. And eventually, if nothing shifts, it begins to feel like self-erasure. Claire could sense that danger, even before she fully named it. She could feel herself becoming too careful, too understanding, too willing to translate neglect into excuses just to protect the image of the man she loved. And so the tragedy was not that she failed to fight for them. It was that she fought in ways so gentle, so loyal, so easy to miss, that Ethan never understood how much of her heart had been spent just trying to remain. 6. The day her voice became smaller. There was no single argument that changed everything. No dramatic moment where Claire raised her voice and declared she had reached her limit. No slammed doors. No words sharp enough to leave visible scars. Instead, the change arrived quietly, so quietly that Ethan barely noticed it at first. It began with something small. Claire stopped finishing her sentences. She would begin to say something about her day, about a thought that had been sitting in her mind for hours. About a feeling she wasn't quite sure how to explain, and then she would pause. Not because the thought had disappeared, but because she could already sense how it might land. Ethan would be looking at his laptop, or scrolling through his phone, or nodding absent-mindedly, the way people nod when their attention is somewhere else entirely. So Claire started editing herself. Not consciously at first. Just small adjustments. Instead of explaining why something hurt, she would say, "It's okay." Instead of sharing a worry, she would say, "It's nothing." Instead of asking for comfort, she would smile and change the subject. Her voice didn't disappear overnight. It simply became smaller, quieter, more careful. The questions she used to ask, about the future, about how Ethan felt, about whether they were still moving in the same direction, began to fade from their conversations. Not because the questions stopped existing, but because asking them started to feel like knocking on a door that opened less and less each time. Claire began choosing silence the way some people choose peace. Not because silence solved anything, but because silence felt safer than disappointment. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from repeating your feelings and watching them land nowhere. From explaining the same loneliness in different words, hoping that one of them might finally reach the other person. Eventually, people stop repeating themselves. Not because their feelings disappeared, but because hope, when ignored too many times, begins to feel naive. Claire could feel that shift happening inside her. The words she once spoke freely began turning inward. Conversations she once imagined having with Ethan now unfolded quietly inside her own mind. She would think about telling him that she felt invisible some nights. That the distance between them seemed to grow even when they were sitting in the same room. But before the words ever reached her lips, another thought would arrive first. Maybe it doesn't matter. And that sentence, small as it seemed, changed everything. Because when someone begins believing their voice doesn't matter, they slowly stop offering it. Claire still spoke, of course. They talked about schedules, about groceries, about the practical details that make daily life move forward. But the deeper parts of her voice, the vulnerable parts, the hopeful parts, began to withdraw. And Ethan mistook that quiet for harmony. He believed the relationship had grown calmer, more stable, less complicated. What he didn't realize was that the relationship hadn't become easier. Claire had simply stopped asking to be fully heard. And when a voice becomes small enough for long enough, something else begins to grow in its place. Distance. Not the loud, dramatic kind that explodes into conflict, but the quiet distance that forms when someone learns how to live beside you, without expecting you to truly listen anymore. 7. Why some people only love when it's safe. Some people do not withhold love because they feel nothing. They withhold it because feeling too much once taught them that closeness could cost them something they did not know how to lose. That was the truth Ethan had never fully faced. From the outside, he looked capable, steady, reliable. The kind of man who could solve problems, carry pressure, and keep moving when life became difficult. But emotional unavailability rarely begins in adulthood. It usually begins much earlier, in rooms where affection was inconsistent, where vulnerability was not welcomed, where love felt safest when it asked for very little. People shaped by those rooms often grow into adults who know how to function beautifully and feel very little while doing it. Or rather, they feel deeply, but only in private, only in pieces, only when they can control the risk. That is why some people only know how to love when it feels safe. Safe means no one is asking too much of them. Safe means affection can stay light, manageable, undemanding. Safe means they can care without being truly seen. Safe means they can remain in the relationship without ever standing emotionally naked inside it. And for a long time, Ethan mistook that version of love for strength. He believed staying composed was maturity. He believed giving practical support was enough to prove devotion. He believed that as long as he did not betray Claire, as long as he came home, as long as he kept their life together on the surface, then whatever was missing between them could wait. But intimacy does not live on surfaces. It lives in the risky places. In the pause before you tell the truth. In the moment you admit, I don't know how to do this. But I don't want to lose you. In the willingness to let another person see what fear has been hiding inside you. That kind of love never felt natural to Ethan. Not because he was incapable of it, but because somewhere in him, love had become associated with exposure. And exposure felt dangerous. Dangerous because once you reveal your deeper need, you can be rejected. Dangerous because once you let someone see your softer parts, they can touch the wound you have spent years hiding from yourself. Dangerous because real closeness does not let you stay divided, competent on the outside, unreachable on the inside. So Ethan loved Claire in ways that allowed him to remain protected. He loved her through routines, through responsibility, through presence without openness, through care that never required him to descend into the parts of himself he had learned to seal off. And at first, that kind of love can still look beautiful. Especially to someone patient. Especially to someone hopeful. Especially to someone like Claire, who kept believing that consistency would eventually deepen into closeness. But safe love has a ceiling. It can comfort, but it cannot fully hold. It can stay near, but it cannot fully meet. It can look stable for years while quietly starving the emotional core of a relationship. Claire was not asking Ethan for perfection. She was asking for risk. For honesty. For emotional movement. For some sign that loving her mattered enough to break through his careful self-protection. But self-protection can become a private prison. And the tragedy is that the person inside it often mistakes the prison walls for wisdom. They call it independence. They call it calm. They call it being, just not that emotional. Meanwhile, the person who loves them begins to understand a painful truth. It is exhausting to keep offering warmth to someone who will only step closer when closeness feels completely safe. Because real love is not safe. Not completely. Real love asks something of us. It asks us to risk being known. To risk being changed. To risk being hurt, and still remain present. And people who have spent years surviving through emotional control often do not realize how much love they have withheld until the person beside them stops reaching. By then, what looked like safety begins to reveal its real name. Distance. And what once felt controlled begins to feel like loss. The moment she finally stopped asking. There is a subtle shift that happens in relationships when someone stops asking for what they need. At first, it looks like patience. It looks like maturity. Like someone who has learned not to pressure the person they love. Like someone who understands that life is complicated. That timing matters. That people carry burdens they don't always know how to explain. But patience, when stretched too far, quietly transforms into something else. It becomes resignation. Claire didn't decide one morning that she would stop asking Ethan for more. It happened gradually, almost invisibly. For a long time, she had been the one who kept the emotional conversation alive. She asked questions that opened space between them. Are you okay? Do you ever feel like we've been drifting? Do you still see the future the same way we used to? Sometimes Ethan answered. Sometimes he changed the subject. Sometimes he said things like, "You worry too much." Or, "Everything is fine, why make things heavier than they need to be?" Those answers weren't cruel. They were simply distant. And distance has a way of exhausting the person who keeps trying to cross it. Claire didn't stop asking because she stopped caring. She stopped asking because each unanswered question left a small bruise somewhere inside her. Not a dramatic wound. Just a quiet accumulation of moments where her emotional reach found nothing on the other side. Eventually, the mind begins protecting the heart in its own quiet way. It whispers a new idea. Maybe it's easier if you expect less. So Claire began lowering her expectations one careful step at a time. She stopped asking Ethan how he felt about them. She stopped asking if he noticed the distance. She stopped asking whether they could talk about the things that felt fragile between them. From the outside, it looked like the relationship had become calmer. There were fewer difficult conversations. Less tension in the room. Even Ethan felt the difference. He interpreted it as progress. as if the relationship had somehow stabilized itself without effort. But what he didn't understand was that Claire had simply moved the conversation somewhere he could no longer hear it. Inside herself. Instead of asking him whether he still felt connected, she asked herself whether connection was still possible. Instead of asking him why he seemed so far away, she asked herself how long she could keep reaching toward someone who no longer noticed the distance. The questions never disappeared. They just changed direction. And when questions turn inward like that, something begins to shift. Hope starts loosening its grip. Not all at once. Just a little at a time. Claire still cared about Ethan. Still loved the version of him she had once known. But something inside her had grown tired of asking for proof that the love was still alive. There is a quiet dignity in that moment. The moment when someone stops begging to be understood. Stops asking to be chosen. Stops explaining their loneliness to someone who keeps responding with silence. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No one announces it. But inside the person who has been asking for so long, something closes gently. A door that once stayed open, even in the cold. Claire did not slam that door. She simply stopped standing there. And when someone stops asking to be loved the way they once did, the relationship enters a very different kind of silence. Not the silence of patience, but the silence that arrives when the heart begins preparing itself to live without the answer it once needed. 9. When distance feels like freedom. At first, Ethan didn't experience the distance as loss. He experienced it as relief. That was the part he would later struggle to admit, even to himself. When Claire stopped asking the difficult questions, something in the apartment changed. The air felt lighter. The evenings felt less tense. There were fewer pauses charged with meaning. Fewer moments where he had to look up from his phone or his work and step into a conversation he never quite knew how to navigate. For a while, that felt like peace. He came home and no longer sensed the quiet disappointment waiting in the room. No more gentle attempts from Claire to ask what he was feeling. No more moments that required him to explain why he had gone absent again. Even while sitting right beside her. He didn't think of it as emotional withdrawal. He thought of it as things finally settling down. And that is one of the most dangerous illusions in love, when emotional distance starts to feel like freedom to the person who has been avoiding intimacy all along. Because freedom, in that kind of relationship, does not mean connection has healed. It usually means one person has simply stopped reaching. Ethan slept more easily in those weeks. He moved through the apartment with less internal resistance. He worked later. Stayed on his phone longer. Allowed the routines of his life to expand and fill every emotional space Claire had once tried to protect. And because nothing was being demanded of him anymore, he mistook the absence of pressure for the presence of stability. That's how avoidance works. It teaches people to confuse comfort with health. If no one is asking hard questions, then everything must be fine. If no one is crying, then no real damage is being done. If the house is quiet, then surely the relationship is safe. But a quiet house can hide a dying bond just as easily as it can hold a peaceful one. Claire had not become less lonely. She had simply stopped delivering her loneliness to Ethan's doorstep. And because he no longer had to face it, his own life felt easier. That ease can be seductive. It can make a person believe they were right all along. That emotional needs were the real source of tension. That if the relationship stayed light enough, it could survive. But love does not become stronger by asking less and less of the people inside it. It becomes thinner, more fragile, more dependent on habit than truth. Ethan did not notice how much of the relationship's emotional life Claire had been carrying until she quietly put that weight down. He didn't notice that her silence was no longer hopeful. That her smiles had become softer, but also more distant. That she had begun protecting her inner world from him, not in anger, but in self-preservation. From his side, the reduction in emotional friction felt like freedom. From hers, it felt like grief becoming private. And the tragedy of that kind of mismatch is that both people can be living in the same apartment and experiencing two completely different realities. One person feels less pressure. The other feels less seen. One feels space. The other feels abandonment. One believes the relationship is finally calming down. The other is slowly detaching in order to survive it. That was the season Ethan misunderstood most. The season where he believed nothing urgent was happening because nothing loud was happening. But the most important endings rarely begin with noise. They begin with quiet permission. Permission not to ask. Permission not to explain. Permission not to hope so much anymore. And by the time distance starts to feel comfortable, something essential has usually already gone missing. Not love, perhaps, but access, warmth, reach. The living bridge between two people. Ethan thought the relationship had become easier because Claire was no longer pulling him toward emotional closeness. What he didn't realize was that the freedom he felt was not the freedom of peace. It was the freedom that appears when someone has stopped trying to bring you back. 10. The suitcase by the door. The suitcase did not look dramatic. That was what unsettled Ethan most. It wasn't thrown open in the middle of the room. Clothes were not spilling out of it in anger. There was no note waiting on the table, no shattered glass, no raised voice still hanging in the air. It was simply there, standing by the door with a calmness that made everything else in the apartment feel suddenly unreal. For a moment, Ethan stared at it as if his mind might rearrange what he was seeing into something harmless. Maybe she was going away for a few days. Maybe she had packed for work. Maybe there was some explanation that wouldn't force him to confront the truth that had been quietly approaching for months. But deep down, he knew. Because some objects do not just sit in a room. They announce what words have been trying not to say. And that suitcase said everything. It said she was tired. It said waiting had finally become heavier than leaving. It said a woman can only stand beside an emotionally closed door for so long before she begins building an exit of her own. Ethan's chest tightened in a way he could not immediately explain. Not panic, not yet. Something stranger than that. Disbelief. The kind that comes when consequences arrive in a form too quiet to argue with. He had imagined, if things ever became serious between them in the wrong way, that there would be signs he could recognize. A fight loud enough to respond to. A threat serious enough to manage. A breakdown obvious enough to make him step forward. But Claire had not given him any of those things. She had not begged. She had not performed her pain. She had not made it easier for him to see the ending while there was still time to interrupt it. She had simply reached the end. And the evidence of that ending stood by the door in clean lines and quiet certainty. There is something devastating about calm departure. Anger leaves room for negotiation. Tears leave room for comfort. Even distance, if it still carries longing, leaves room for hope. But calm can mean the decision has already been lived through internally. It can mean all the pleading, grieving, and bargaining happened in silence, long before the other person ever noticed. That was what Ethan was really seeing. Not just a suitcase, but the physical shape of all the nights Claire had cried without telling him. All the conversations she rehearsed and never had. All the moments she looked at him and realized she was still alone. Even while standing inches away. The suitcase by the door was not impulsive. It was patient pain made visible. And maybe that is why it felt so unbearable. Because it carried no drama he could defend himself against. Only truth. Truth about how far things had gone. Truth about how long she had been carrying the loneliness by herself. Truth about the fact that love can disappear slowly in plain sight while the person being loved keeps assuming there is still time. Ethan stood there, still wearing his coat, still holding the habits of his ordinary life around him like they might protect him from what was happening. But nothing about the room was ordinary anymore. The lamp in the corner still glowed softly. The kitchen counter was still clean. The hallway was still lined with the same framed photographs that had once made this place feel like the beginning of something lasting. And yet the suitcase changed the meaning of every familiar thing. It made the apartment feel less like a home and more like a place where one person had stayed too long in silence. That is the cruelty of emotional endings. They often become visible only when they are already in motion. Only when something has finally crossed from feeling into form. From ache into action. Ethan had overlooked tears he never saw. Questions she stopped asking. Distance he mistook for peace. But he could not overlook the suitcase. Because some truths, once placed by the door, refuse to remain abstract. They ask only one question. What will you do now that the leaving is real? 11 The words he was too late to say. For a few seconds, Ethan just stood there, staring at Claire as if the right sentence might arrive on its own. But the truth is, the right sentence had been needed much earlier. Not now. Not when the suitcase was already packed. Not when her face had that strange stillness that comes after too many private disappointments. Not when the room itself seemed to hold the shape of everything he had failed to notice. Still, panic has a way of making people reach for words they once withheld too easily. So he tried. Claire, wait. It was such a small sentence. So fragile. So painfully insufficient against the weight of all the silence that had come before it. She looked at him, not angrily, not coldly, just with the tired attention of someone who had already listened too long for things that never came. Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't know it was this bad. And even as he said it, he heard the weakness in it. Because not knowing was not innocence. Not in love. Not when someone had spent months shrinking their pain into forms gentle enough for you to survive. Not when the signs had always been there. Just quiet enough to ignore. Claire didn't interrupt him. That somehow made it harder. He took a step closer. Then stopped, as though he had suddenly become aware of how much distance can exist between two people standing in the same room. I know I've been distant, he said. I know I've been somewhere else. But I never stopped loving you. There it was. The sentence men like Ethan often save for the final minute. As if feeling something deeply in private can somehow make up for failing to express it in time. I never stopped loving you. The tragedy of those words is that they can be true and still arrive too late. Because love, when left unspoken too long, begins to lose its power as evidence. It starts to sound less like shelter and more like memory. Less like presence and more like explanation. Claire's eyes softened, but not in relief. In grief. As if hearing him say what she had once begged life to let her hear only confirmed how late the moment had become. Ethan kept going, the way people do when they sense they are losing something and believe language might still close the distance. I thought we had time. That was the most honest thing he had said all night. Not because it fixed anything. But because it named the illusion that had protected him for so long. Time. He had treated love as if it were endlessly renewable. As if closeness could be postponed without consequence. As if a heart that waited faithfully would keep waiting simply because it always had before. I thought once work calmed down, once things got easier, I'd be better, I'd be more here, He stopped. Because the future had always been his favorite hiding place. One day. After this week. When things settle. Soon. But soon is often the softest form of abandonment. It gives hope just enough air to survive while slowly starving it at the same time. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back at him with the unbearable tenderness of someone who no longer needed him to explain himself. That was what broke him most. Not anger. Not accusation. Not even the suitcase. It was the absence of demand. She was no longer trying to pull the truth out of him. No longer fighting to be reassured. No longer asking him to choose emotional presence over comfort. And without her asking, his words suddenly sounded like what they were. Late. Necessary, perhaps. Real, perhaps. But late. I'm sorry, he said, and this time the words trembled. I'm sorry I made you feel alone. That sentence came closer to the wound. Closer than the promises. Closer than the explanations. Closer than, I love you, which had floated above the relationship for too long without ever fully entering it. Because loneliness had always been the real story. Not betrayal. Not cruelty. Just the slow ache of being emotionally abandoned by someone who kept insisting they were still there. Ethan finally understood that now. But understanding, when it comes at the edge of loss, has a different feeling than wisdom. It feels like watching a bridge collapse just as you begin to cross it. He wanted to tell her that he had been afraid. That he had mistaken control for strength. That he had kept waiting to become the kind of man who knew how to love her well without realizing love was the very thing meant to teach him. He wanted to tell her that her silence had terrified him precisely because it proved she had suffered without him. He wanted to say all the tender, honest things that might have mattered months ago. But timing is part of love. And some truths, when delayed too long, no longer sound like rescue. They sound like mourning. Claire stood there quietly, receiving his words the way one receives rain after a season of drought, aware that it is real. Aware that it is needed, but also aware that it came too late to save what had already dried inside. And Ethan, for the first time, understood the brutal difference between feeling love and making someone feel loved. 12 You were never really here. Claire did not raise her voice when she said it. That was what made the words land so hard. There was no anger sharpening them, no attempt to wound him back, no bitterness spilling over after months of restraint. She said them quietly, almost gently, like someone placing the final truth between them with hands that had grown tired of carrying it alone. You were never really here. For a second, Ethan looked at her as if he had misheard. Because of course he had been there. He had slept in the same bed. He had walked through the same apartment. He had paid the bills, fixed what was broken, answered practical questions, remembered schedules, shown up in all the visible ways people point to when they want to prove they stayed. But Claire was not talking about visibility. She was talking about presence. And those two things, though people confuse them all the time, are not the same. A person can stand right beside you and still leave you emotionally alone. A person can kiss your forehead, ask if you ate, tell you they're tired, sit across from you every evening, and still never fully arrive where your heart has been waiting. That was the wound she had been living inside. Not the absence of a body. The absence of a meeting. Of being felt. Of being reached for without having to ask twice. Of speaking from the deepest part of herself and not feeling like her words had to travel through glass to get to him. Claire held his gaze, not to punish him, but because she could no longer protect him from what was true. There were nights, she said softly, when you were in the room with me, and I still felt completely alone. Ethan's face tightened. Because suddenly all the things he had once called normal began to sound different in the light of her honesty. The evenings when he answered with nods instead of attention. The dinners where his phone remained face up beside his plate. The moments she gathered courage to open something vulnerable, only to watch him smooth it over with reassurance before ever truly entering it. He had thought he was keeping the peace. He had thought not fighting was a kind of love. He had thought staying calm meant staying safe. But peace without presence is not peace at all. It is just loneliness with better manners. Claire's voice never rose, it only deepened. I kept telling myself you were stressed. That work was hard, that you loved me in the way you knew how. And maybe that was true. Maybe you did. But love that never reaches the person standing right in front of you begins to feel a lot like being abandoned in slow motion. There are sentences that do not sound cruel until you realize how much pain had to exist before someone could say them that clearly. This was one of them. Because Claire was not accusing him of not caring. She was naming something more devastating than that. That caring, when kept trapped inside someone, can fail the very person it claims to love. Ethan opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to defend himself, maybe to say again that he had never meant for things to go this far. But intent has very little comfort to offer someone who has already been starving. Claire had spent too long surviving on almost love. On partial presence. On affection that appeared in fragments but disappeared whenever real closeness required emotional risk. You were here when things were easy, she said. You were here when life could stay on the surface. But when I needed you to really see me, when I needed you to step into the hard human part of loving someone, you disappeared every time. That was the part he could not escape. Not because it was exaggerated, but because it was precise. She was not saying he never showed up physically. She was saying he kept leaving emotionally at the exact moments she needed him most. And that kind of absence is difficult to defend against. Because from the outside it barely looks like absence at all. It looks like a decent man. A tired man. A responsible man. It looks like someone who does not realize that emotional neglect often hides inside ordinary behavior. Claire drew in a breath. Steady but fragile. I stopped asking for more because every time I did, I felt smaller. I started feeling like my needs were too much. Like my sadness was inconvenient. Like the most honest parts of me kept arriving in the wrong place. Ethan lowered his eyes then. Because there are moments when shame enters not as humiliation, but as recognition. He had thought her silence meant she needed less. He had thought her gentleness meant she was stronger than the ache. He had thought the relationship could survive on shared space, shared routine, shared history. But none of that could substitute for emotional arrival. None of that could replace the sacred, terrifying act of fully showing up inside another person's pain. Claire's final words came almost in a whisper. I don't think you meant to leave me alone, she said, but that doesn't change the fact that I was. And sometimes that is the sentence that breaks the illusion for good. Not, you never loved me. Not, you ruined everything. But simply, I was alone. And you were close enough to see it. That is the heartbreak of emotional unavailability. Not always cruelty. Not always betrayal. Sometimes just a long pattern of almost being there. Until the person waiting finally understands that almost is not where love is meant to live. 13. Why emotional neglect hurts more than betrayal. Some wounds arrive all at once. Betrayal is often like that. It has a date. A moment. A sentence you can repeat back to yourself. A before and an after. That kind of pain is brutal. But it is clear. You can point to it. You can name the hour it entered your life. You can say, this is where everything broke. Emotional neglect is different. It does not always break your heart in one loud moment. It wears it down in private. Slowly. Quietly. Almost politely. That is why it can hurt more than betrayal. Not because it is more dramatic. But because it is harder to prove. Harder to explain, and often harder even for the person living through it to fully trust what they feel. When someone betrays you, the wound comes with evidence. There is something visible to hold. A lie. A secret. A choice made against you. But when someone neglects you emotionally, the evidence is made of absences. The conversation that never happened. The comfort that never arrived. The eye contact that drifted away too soon. The moments you reached for connection and found yourself touching air. How do you explain that kind of pain to someone who keeps saying, "But I'm here, aren't I?" That is what makes emotional neglect so disorienting. It creates loneliness without clean proof. It leaves a person starving in a room that, from the outside, still looks full. Claire had lived inside that confusion for a long time. There had been no affair to discover. No shocking confession. No obvious cruelty she could hold up and say, "See, this is why I'm hurting." There was only the ache of being loved in fragments. Just enough tenderness to keep doubting herself. Just enough kindness to make her question whether she was asking for too much. Just enough presence to make her wonder whether the emptiness she felt was somehow her own fault. That is the cruelty of emotional neglect. It does not always remove love completely. It often leaves behind just enough of it to keep a person waiting. Waiting for a better week. A softer version of tomorrow. A conversation that finally goes deeper. A moment when the person they love will stop skimming the surface and truly arrive. And while they wait, something inside them begins to thin. Their confidence. Their voice. Their ability to trust their own pain. Because when hurt has no dramatic event attached to it, people often turn the accusation inward. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe this is just what adult love looks like. Maybe I should be more grateful. Maybe needing more closeness means I'm the problem. That inner erosion can be worse than a single act of betrayal. Betrayal shocks the system. Neglect rewires it. It teaches a person to minimize themselves before anyone else has to ask for less. To expect less. To translate their hunger into silence so they will not seem difficult to love. Claire had done that for months, maybe longer. Not because she was weak, but because emotional neglect does not usually make people leave quickly. It makes them stay and slowly disappear. That is why it cuts so deeply. It is not only the pain of not receiving what you needed. It is the pain of watching yourself adapt to the lack of it. Watching yourself become quieter, smaller, easier, more careful, not because that is who you are, but because you are trying to survive inside a love that keeps forgetting to reach for you. And the person causing that pain may not even understand the damage. That can make it hurt even more. Betrayal says, "You were not chosen." Emotional neglect says something even more haunting. You were close enough to be loved, and still somehow left untouched. There is a particular grief in that. Because betrayal can make you angry. It can help you separate. It can give your pain a clear enemy. Neglect leaves you mourning something more confusing. Not the total absence of love, but the repeated presence of love that never became enough to feel safe inside. Claire was not grieving a dramatic ending. She was grieving all the moments that should have been small rescues and were not. The nights she wanted to be asked one more question. The pauses where she hoped he would notice her face and didn't. The times she needed warmth and received efficiency. The times she offered her heart and felt it gently set aside for later. That is why emotional neglect can live so long in the body. Because the body remembers patterns. It remembers what it feels like to sit beside someone and still brace for loneliness. To speak and prepare not to land. To hope and already expect disappointment. And by the time the relationship finally breaks in visible form, the deeper heartbreak often happened much earlier. Long before the suitcase. Long before the goodbye. Long before the words that made the ending official. The real heartbreak began in all the invisible moments where love could have moved closer. And didn't. 14, the man he had become. Ethan had spent years becoming someone the world would admire. A man who could endure pressure without flinching. A man who solved problems quickly, spoke carefully, moved efficiently. A man who looked dependable from the outside because he had trained himself to never appear undone on the inside. For a long time, that version of him felt like success. People trusted him. They relied on him. They called him disciplined, focused, strong. And in many ways, he was all of those things. But strength can become distorted when it is built only around survival. Because survival teaches you how to function. It does not always teach you how to feel. It teaches you how to keep going. It does not always teach you how to stay present when another heart is breaking beside you. Standing there in front of Claire, with the weight of her words still hanging in the room, Ethan began to see something he had spent years avoiding. He had not simply become busy. He had not simply become stressed. He had become unreachable. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But slowly, through repetition. By choosing control over honesty. By choosing composure over closeness. By choosing usefulness over vulnerability so many times that eventually he no longer knew how to offer anything deeper. That realization did not arrive like a lightning strike. It came more like a mirror being cleaned. Painfully. Gradually. Until the image could no longer be blurred. He saw the man he had become, someone capable of building a life. But not always capable of fully entering it. Someone who could provide comfort in practical forms, yet hesitate when love required emotional risk. Someone who had confused restraint with maturity for so long that he had never noticed how much warmth had drained out of his presence. That is one of the hardest truths a person can face, not that they were evil. Not that they meant harm. But that they slowly became the kind of person who could wound others simply by staying defended. Ethan had always believed he was protecting something. His focus. His future. His ability to keep everything from falling apart. What he never asked himself was what that protection was costing the people who loved him. Because self-protection, when left unquestioned, can become selfishness in a language soft enough to hide from itself. It does not announce itself as cruelty. It calls itself being practical. Being tired. Being under pressure. Being someone who just isn't good at feelings. But the effect can still be devastating. Claire had not been asking him to become another person. She had been asking him to come closer as the person he already was. And somehow, that had felt harder to him than all the pressure he knew how to carry in the outside world. That truth unsettled him. Because it meant the real problem had never been time alone. It had never been work alone. It had never been circumstance alone. The deeper problem was the identity he had built around emotional distance. A man who knew how to stay needed, but not how to stay known. A man who knew how to remain physically loyal, but not emotionally open. A man who could be praised for his steadiness by everyone around him while the person closest to him quietly disappeared from loneliness. There is a particular grief in realizing that the version of yourself you worked hardest to become is the very version that cannot love the way someone needed. Ethan felt that grief now. Not just grief for Claire, but grief for himself. For the softer version of him that had gone missing somewhere along the way. For the honest words he had replaced with silence. For the tenderness he had delayed so many times it began to feel unnatural. He understood, maybe for the first time, that emotional unavailability is not just about what a person withholds from others. It is also about what they withhold from their own life. Joy becomes muted. Connection becomes partial. Love becomes something they feel internally but struggle to translate into experiences another person can actually live inside. And over time, they mistake being controlled for being whole. But wholeness is not the absence of visible cracks. It is the willingness to let love enter the places you usually protect. Ethan looked at Claire and realized that the man he had become was not a monster. That would have been easier. He was something much more common. And because of that, much more tragic. A decent man who had learned how to avoid the deepest work of love. A man who had mistaken not failing loudly for succeeding quietly. A man who had stayed respectable at the cost of becoming unreachable. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of all. Sometimes the people who break a heart are not the ones who come in like a storm. Sometimes they are the ones who arrive every day, say all the reasonable things, keep all the obvious promises, and still never fully show up where it matters most. That was the man Ethan had become. And once he saw him clearly, he could no longer hide behind the life that had helped create him. 15. The love that changed shape. Love does not always disappear. Sometimes it simply changes shape. That is one of the quietest truths people discover after a relationship has already begun to fracture. We imagine love as something that either exists or doesn't, as if it were a switch that flips on or off. But love rarely behaves that way. More often, it transforms slowly, until one day you realize the thing you once held has become something else entirely. Ethan could feel that transformation now, even before either of them had officially said goodbye. The love between him and Claire had not vanished in a dramatic moment. It had not exploded into anger or dissolved into hatred. If anything, what remained between them was strangely calm. But calm does not always mean whole. Sometimes calm is simply what love looks like after it has lost the strength to reach. Claire stood across from him with a softness that had once been filled with hope. He remembered the earlier version of that softness, the one that carried expectation, warmth, and a quiet belief that if they kept showing up for each other, something beautiful would grow. But that softness had shifted. It was no longer reaching toward him. It was protecting itself. That is how love changes shape when it has waited too long. It stops stretching outward and begins folding inward. Not out of cruelty. Not out of revenge. But out of survival. Claire still cared about him. That much was obvious in the way her voice never hardened. In the way she refused to turn their history into accusations. But caring is not always the same as staying. Love can continue to exist even when the relationship can no longer hold it. That is one of the most painful contradictions people face. Because if love had disappeared completely, leaving would feel simpler. If the heart had turned cold, the decision would feel clean. But when love merely changes shape, the ending becomes more complicated. There is still tenderness. Still memory. Still the quiet recognition that something real once lived between two people. And yet the structure that once held that love begins to collapse. Claire had reached the place where love was no longer asking Ethan to become different. It was no longer trying to convince him, no longer waiting for the moment he would finally open the emotional door she had stood beside for so long. Instead, her love had transformed into something quieter. Respect for what had been. Compassion for the man he was still becoming. And enough self-respect to stop offering her heart in places where it kept returning unanswered. That shift was not loud. There was no dramatic speech. No anger. No slammed doors. Just a subtle change in gravity. For months, Claire's love had leaned toward Ethan, hoping to pull him closer. Now the center of gravity had moved back inside her. She was standing upright again. Not because she stopped loving him, but because loving him no longer required her to disappear. Ethan could feel that difference. Before, her presence had carried a quiet question, "Will you come closer?" Now her presence carried something else entirely. "I will survive even if you don't." That realization unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Anger still means the heart is fighting. This was different. This was peace after exhaustion. The kind of peace people reach when they finally stop trying to change a pattern that has already revealed itself too many times. And yet, even inside that distance, love had not become cruel. Claire did not erase their memories. She did not pretend their years together meant nothing. Instead, she seemed to be doing something more difficult. She was allowing love to evolve into something that could exist without destroying her. Sometimes love becomes partnership. Sometimes love becomes friendship. Sometimes love becomes a quiet gratitude for the chapter that once shaped your life. And sometimes love becomes the strength to let someone go without turning them into the villain of your story. Claire had arrived at that last form. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only version of love that still allowed her to remain whole. Ethan realized then that love had not truly left the room. It had simply stopped begging to be recognized. It had taken a different form, one that no longer asked him to change, but also no longer depended on him to stay. And that may be the most bittersweet transformation love can make. When it stops trying to hold two people together, and quietly learns how to release one of them. 16. The lesson most people learn too late. Most people do not lose love all at once. They lose it in small, forgettable moments they do not understand the importance of while they are living them. In the moment, it never looks like the end. It looks like answering a message later. It looks like saying, "I'm tired," instead of, "Talk to me." It looks like hearing pain in someone's voice and assuming it can wait until tomorrow. It looks like believing that loyalty is enough. That staying in the room is the same thing as showing up with your heart. That is the lesson so many people learn too late. Love does not survive on intention alone. It does not survive because you meant well. It does not survive because deep down you cared. It does not survive because, in your private thoughts, you never stopped loving the person standing in front of you. Love survives when it is felt. When it is made visible. When it is translated from emotion into presence. Into attention. Into warmth. Into the sacred discipline of noticing another person before they have to beg to be noticed. That is where Ethan failed. Not because he was evil. Not because he wanted Claire to hurt. But because he believed he had more time than he did. And that is the quiet tragedy hidden inside so many relationships. People think love is disappearing because of one big disaster. But often, it disappears through delay. Delayed honesty. Delayed tenderness. Delayed apology. Delayed presence. And delay has a way of dressing itself up as responsibility. I'll fix this after work. I'll be more available next month. I'll open up when life gets less stressful. I'll love them better once I have more space to breathe. But life rarely pauses long enough for people to become who they keep promising to become later. Later is where many relationships go to die. Because the human heart can endure pain for a long time. What it struggles to survive is repeated postponement. The feeling of always being next on someone's list. The feeling of being loved, but never quite reached. The feeling of standing close to a person for months, or years, and still wondering whether your inner world matters to them in the way theirs matters to you. That kind of ache changes people. It makes them quieter, more careful, less hopeful, until one day, they are no longer asking for closeness. Not because they stopped loving, but because they finally understand that love should not require them to abandon themselves just to remain. That is the lesson. Not that love always ends. Not that emotionally distant people are unlovable. Not even that regret cannot teach us something meaningful. The lesson is simpler and harder. If someone matters to you, do not wait until their silence becomes easier for you to live with. Do not confuse the absence of conflict with the presence of connection. Do not confuse routine with intimacy. Do not confuse loyalty with emotional courage. And above all, do not wait for a packed suitcase, a quiet goodbye, or a final confession to discover what the other person has been surviving beside you. By then, the lesson may still be true, but truth arriving late does not always save what it finally reveals. Some people spend years learning how to appear strong. Very few learn, early enough, that real strength in love is not control. It is responsiveness. It is the ability to notice a change in someone's voice. To hear what they are saying before they stop saying it. To step toward them while the door is still open. To risk awkward honesty instead of polished distance. To say, I don't know how to do this perfectly, but I want to understand you. While there is still time for that sentence to land like comfort instead of grief. Because that is what most people learn too late. A relationship rarely collapses at the moment of departure. It begins collapsing at the moment one person feels emotionally alone and the other mistakes that loneliness for peace. So if this story leaves anything behind, let it be this. Notice sooner. Ask one more question. Put the phone down. Stay in the hard conversation a little longer. Say the tender thing before pride edits it away. Do not assume the people you love will always keep translating your silence into patience. One day, they may stop. And when they stop, what remains may not be anger. It may not even be blame. It may simply be the quiet, irreversible shape of someone learning how to live without the love they begged you to make visible. If this story touched something real in you, share it with someone who may need to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us, have you ever felt alone beside someone who said they loved you? If this message spoke to a part of your life that words rarely reach, like this video, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more emotional truths, quiet healing, and stories that uncover what people carry in silence.